Okay, so let's talk about the new encyclical, the first encyclical of Pope Leo the 14th. At least just some brief thoughts for now on the matter. Perhaps we'll do a more extensive review in the future, but I wanted to just briefly touch on a few things that I'm seeing um, being discussed heavily online. Well, one of the first clips that I started seeing being shared online since the release of the new encyclical yesterday was a co-founder of the AI company Anthropic, who was present with Pope Leo at the Vatican upon the release of the document. And Pope Leo and Anthropic are having some kind of collaboration. And so the co-founder, expressed some concerns about AI. Now, this is an AI company expressing some concerns about the future of AI. If you're not familiar with Anthropic, where this is most likely relevant, and a lot of people have pointed out, is that the US government was at one point using their AI model. And at some point, they wanted to start using it to be fully autonomous when it comes to weapons and weapon systems. Pete Hegseth was pushing for that. And Anthropic said, no, it doesn't need to be fully autonomous. And I think we've actually seen some negative results of the use of AI already in warfare. I mean, some people are saying that AI was used in part for this strike on the Iranian school, where you have an elementary school struck on the first day of the war. Others are also saying that Israel heavily uses AI to target people in Gaza. And so a lot of the destruction is partly a result of this. Whether there's truth to that, different discussion, but that's certainly in the conversation. Well, Anthropic doesn't want Pete Hegseth's vision for the use of AI and is warning against it. And so the government officially has said they're not going to use it, but evidently still actually used their systems even after Trump said we're not using Anthropic. Okay, so there's some kind of rivalry between Anthropic and the US government, Pete Hegseth, Trump, his administration, all of that, over this situation. So for Pope Leo to bring him on further feeds into this rivalry that we see now between the Pope and the Trump administration. And so whether there's an intention there or not, it certainly feeds into that. And by the way, I'm not criticizing that. I'm just pointing that out, that there's already a rivalry between these companies and the U.S. administration, and also the Pope and the U.S. administration. Okay. So he was there and he was warning and saying, look, this is going to cause serious problems, AI, that is, for the future. It's going to replace a lot of people as workers. And so we're going to be responsible for all of these people and their livelihood. And so this is something that needs to be considered. And so that's one of the clips that's kind of been floating around out there. And, effectively the Pope, in collaborating with him and also in this encyclical, is not saying AI is inherently wrong and is bad and we can't use AI. He's rather saying, look, this is a tool and it can be used for good or used for evil. And a lot of people are trying to use it for evil. And we need to use discretion here. We need to be careful and we need to use it for good. And we also don't need to put it in the hands of a whole bunch of wealthy people, where the people that are less fortunate financially are ultimately the losers here. And only the wealthy people have this control and have this power. And so that's part of the message as well. And, if I had to maybe summarize the idea, I would maybe point you to paragraph 76 that says this: solidarity demands that decisions regarding data, algorithms, platforms, and artificial intelligence take into account not only the immediate benefit for a few, but also the impact on all peoples and on future generations. So he's very careful to note that the way in which we use AI, we need to be mindful of everyone, be mindful of the poor, be mindful of the less fortunate, and also be mindful of future generations. And that's a great message, right? Wonderful stuff. Love it. I think that that's true. There's some really good moral guidance here with that. So look, if you take nothing else from it, just try to understand that what the Pope is doing here is he's calling for us to morally or responsibly use artificial intelligence. Not to say that we can't use it, but to say, look, it's already here. Let's use this as an effective tool for good rather than a tool for exploitation and human suffering. So, if you took nothing else from it, take that away. And that's a good message. And I also have to say, look, the topic of AI and addressing this, I think it needs to be addressed, right? And I do think it makes sense that the Pope would address this issue. I know the Trump administration, its first reaction was, what is the Pope doing pontificating on AI? Pun intended, by the way. Well, this is part of the Pope's responsibility, speaking on matters of faith and morals, and this certainly relates to morals, right? So this is definitely within his realm. It makes sense for him to address it and even have an entire encyclical on it. So, for me, it makes sense. Although I'm going to have some comments on that here in a moment, but let's maybe talk about two of the controversial passages that have been coming up and immediately came up in my feed on Twitter. People were quoting this before they really quoted anything else. Two things, one on slavery and one on just war theory. The part on slavery is paragraph 176. And perhaps what I'll do here is share my screen and show you that paragraph. And let's just briefly discuss these, controversial passages, the ones that are really making their rounds. So let me share my screen and you should be able to see it at this point. Okay. In the development of her doctrine, the church has gradually come to a deeper awareness of the gravity of these issues. It is true that past events cannot be judged anachronistically, as though the moral criteria that matured over time has always been available. That itself might be controversial, right? That you would have moral criteria available at a later time that's not available earlier. Yet neither can we deny or diminish the delay with which both society and the church came to denounce the scourge of slavery. Now, I've pointed this out many times. A lot of people have gaslighted me. A lot of people have just said, Michael, you're misreading things. Michael, you don't know what you're talking about. But I've pointed out many times, yes, you do have some popes who denounce slavery. You do have that. But you also do have some popes who authorize it and defend it doctrinally. So it isn't just a prudential matter, although matters of prudence are still doctrinal. But in the minds of a lot of people, they think that there's a difference between doctrine and prudence. And prudential judgments still relate to matters of faith and morals. But this wasn't like some kind of necessarily non-doctrinal statement or disciplinary statement, but rather on occasion these were doctrinal. These were done on a doctrinal basis, and so they were doctrinally justified. And so, for people who try to just dismiss this and say, hey, the popes have always been against slavery, or it was just a disciplinary issue, it's just not true. Okay, so I've pointed that out many times and pointed out there's a difficulty here. And he's about to admit that. He's going to be the first pope who finally admits it, because we've actually had Vatican documents gaslighting us and try to tell us that, no, it really wasn't that way, or avoiding the controversial parts of this discussion from previous popes and just kind of gaslighting us. And here the Pope finally just comes out and admits it. So that I appreciate. He says in antiquity and the Middle Ages, many individuals and even ecclesial institutions had slaves. Already in the early modern period, the Apostolic See of Rome, responding to requests from sovereigns, intervened several times in order to regulate and legitimize forms of subjugation. Now, that's a very nice and guarded way to say that some popes did teach doctrinally that slavery could be justified. How does that work in light of the church now saying that this is against human dignity and it can no longer be supported doctrinally? He's not going to explain. He's not going to engage the tough discussion here. How does it make sense that the church once taught this and now teaches against it? And this is a conversation that we are going to continue to have, because I see it many, many times in different places. If you compare something taught previously by the magisterium and something presently, there will be this tension, but there won't be any attempt on part of the magisterium to explain, here's how we understand this tension. There's no frank admission of, okay, we made a mistake. We erred in our teaching here, and now we're correcting course. Or there's no attempt to say, well, here's how it wasn't previously an error, and here's how we're not contradicting ourselves. No attempt on part of the magisterium to explain these things. Okay, but here he is being candid, at least saying that more than perhaps other popes have been, that yes, at some point in various points in history, some popes have legitimized some forms of slavery. And in certain cases, the enslavement of infidels, so everyone who is non-Catholic. And, you know, I've actually talked about these cases where the popes have done this. Some of the popes have done this, not all of them. Some of them rejected this. But in some cases, you do have popes who say everyone who's non-Catholic can be enslaved and their descendants can be as well. So these weren't just like war criminals, people captured in war, and you can now enslave them. No, they're then saying that they're reduced to perpetual servitude, and this is applicable to not only them, but also their descendants. Look, that's obviously morally wrong, right? Very clearly. And now the church is saying, hey, that is wrong. We now have a greater awareness of human dignity. Fair enough. But maybe explain, why is it that we see doctrinal errors previously and now they're being corrected? And how does that make sense with the reliability of the magisterium? Those are going to be questions that everyone's going to be wondering about, and it's just not tackled by the magisterium. It is the subject of my doctoral dissertation, so it's something that's important to me and something I'm tackling there, but I would like to see the magisterium tackle it. Now, it says it was only in the 19th century that a formal, absolute, and universal condemnation of slavery was clearly articulated. You know, some Catholic theologians would disagree with that. Francis Sullivan would disagree with that and say, actually, those prohibitions against slavery were not absolute. Even John Paul II's condemnations of slavery, they would argue, are not absolute. So again, maybe see Francis Sullivan on that. He says Leo the 13th is an example of that. But again, there's going to be a lot of theologians that would point out, actually, he wasn't condemning all forms of slavery. Okay. This development offers a clear example of the church's growth in understanding the perennial truths of revelation that she safeguards. Although there was not always consistency in practice. Well, what about also in doctrine? Given that slavery was long tolerated, in some cases it was more than tolerated, it was authorized, before being unequivocally condemned. Has it been unequivocally condemned? There has been a continuous affirmation throughout history of the dignity of every human being. Has there? I don't know about that one. I mean, gosh, I look at a lot of parts of church history, and I don't see this notion of human dignity being strongly affirmed. Created in the image of God, even if it took 18 centuries for its full incompatibility with slavery to be explicitly recognized. Okay, so he's saying now we recognize it. But I would like to see a more thorough engagement of how it took this long to recognize it and how this makes sense in light of the claims of the reliability of the magisterium. This constitutes a wound in Christian memory, one from which we cannot consider ourselves detached. Well done. And I commend him for admitting this. It is impossible not to feel deep sorrow when contemplating the immense suffering and humiliation endured by so many, in stark contrast to the immeasurable dignity as persons infinitely loved by the Lord. For this, in the name of the church, I sincerely ask for pardon. Well done. Well done, Pope Leo. I appreciate that. Could he go further here? Could he do more here? Of course. But look, you got to give it to him. At least he's said that. I haven't seen any popes be this candid before and ask for pardon in this kind of way. I can think of maybe a few vague cases of John Paul II offering some apologies, but this is going further than that, right? So I really appreciate him being candid here. Why is he doing this? Why is he even talking about this? Well, look, he's pointing out that AI and some uses of AI can be forms of slavery. And so if we're not going to be in a situation where we end up having to apologize in the future for not condemning this early on, let's go ahead and condemn it now. But in order to condemn it now, you got to condemn the past sins in the church. So that's effectively why he's bringing up this conversation here. So it makes sense for him to address it, right? In order to be consistent. My only constructive criticism here would be, again, you really need to explain in the minds of the average person how the reliability of the magisterium is sustained in light of this. And maybe be a little bit more candid by the doctrinal nature of the approval of slavery in previous cases, and how that works where you can have doctrinal error in the magisterium, but it's still overly reliable. That's a conversation that needs to be had, because I can guarantee you everyone else is having that conversation outside the Catholic Church. So it needs to be addressed, certainly by the magisterium itself. Okay, not to belabor the point, let's move on. Just war theory. Similarly, we have a situation with that in paragraph 192. It says, to all this, the media and digital dimensions are adding new and decisive elements, communication networks, fragmented information environments, and algorithms that reward conflict can magnify polarization and resentment. That's a very good observation. Increased propaganda. Yeah, we're seeing that. And make shared discernment more difficult. Very true. Thus, war is not only fought, but also culturally conditioned through simplistic narratives, a friend or foe mentality, disinformation, and fear. Spot on. I mean, I really think in a lot of ways, a lot of the wars that we've seen recently are from propaganda. And social media is now playing a part in that and spreading that propaganda to continue to further perpetuate and justify these ridiculous wars that we're in. So, look, really good observation. Very glad he brought that up, because it has a lot of application to what we're seeing today. When historical memory fades and the ethical principles that protect civilians and the most vulnerable are weakened, it becomes easier to justify violence as necessary, inevitable, and even sanitized. Correct. I mean, I'm seeing that from the Trump administration. Pete Hegseth and others, Lindsey Graham and others, trying to use the Bible to justify all these things, trying to use Christianity to justify these wars of aggression and to sanitize it all. It is in this context that humanity is slipping into a violent culture of power, where peace no longer appears as a responsibility to be taken on, but as a fragile interval between conflicts. Today, more than ever, without prejudice to the right to self-defense in the strictest sense. So he's talking about here, there is a right to self-defense if someone is like in the process actively attacking you. You have the right to defend yourself. He's saying there is that. But then he says it's important to reaffirm that just war theory, which has all too often been used to justify any kind of war, is now outdated. Okay. Let's pause here for a moment. I've been pointing out that this is Pope Leo's view of just war theory. Whether you agree with it or not, different conversation. I've just been pointing out this is his view. Bishop Barron and others have gaslighted us, trying to tell us he's an Augustinian, so he's all in favor of just war theory. And I've told people that doesn't even logically follow, because Augustine also taught that if infants don't receive communion, they go to hell. Does the church teach that today? No. Does Pope Leo teach that today? No. Just because he's an Augustinian doesn't mean he believes everything that Augustine taught. So just because he's an Augustinian doesn't mean he believes just war theory. It's a dumb argument that Bishop Barron and others used to gaslight us. So I pointed that out. People continue to gaslight, say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, here it is. He thinks it's outdated. Okay, so again, regardless of your view in favor or against just war theory, he believes it doesn't have any application to today. And no, the strict right to self-defense is not just war theory. There is more to just war theory. There is in just war theory a um, situation where you can strike first, and he's actually about to address that here. So he says humanity possesses far more effective and more capable tools for promoting human life and resolving conflicts, such as dialogue, diplomacy, and forgiveness. So, what is his rationale for saying this doctrine is no longer um, applicable to today, outdated? Well, he says, well, there's other things available. There's dialogue, diplomacy, and forgiveness. The problem with that is that's always been available. When has dialogue, diplomacy, and forgiveness not been available? How can we argue that it's available today but wasn't available previously? I'm sorry, that's just not a good argument. It's always been available since day one, since the dawn of time. Dialogue, diplomacy, forgiveness has been available for thousands of years. So if you had that thousands of years ago, but you had cases for just war theory then, why wouldn't you have that now? How is it outdated? Well, I'll say it's not outdated on the basis of those things for obvious reasons, because again, that was available previously. If it's outdated, he would need to give other arguments for it. This wouldn't work. But he says the use of force, violence, and weapons reflects a relational poverty that always has disastrous consequences for civilian populations. True, very true. And we are seeing that now. We're seeing that in cases where there's clearly an intention to target civilians, but we've also seen it in many cases where there wasn't an intention, but there's collateral damage, right? And so he's rightly calling this out. So look, I get it. I understand his concern here, because I share the same concern. People are attempting to justify bogus wars, right? They're trying to justify wars of aggression and couching it as a just war under just war theory. But we've seen very clearly the war with Iran, for example, does not meet the criteria of just war theory, even if you're holding to that criteria today. It doesn't. So maybe Pope Leo doesn't have to go this far and just say it's outdated. Maybe he doesn't have to go that far. Maybe he just needs to say, well, no, it's still applicable. It's just not applicable in today's situation with the Iran war, or with, what Israel is doing, for example. Because you can clearly see what Israel is doing, what the U.S. is doing, does not meet the criteria of just war theory. So I don't know if you really have to throw out the whole thing to make the point. So here, there's I have an appreciation for what he's trying to do, but maybe there's perhaps a better way to do it. But you can understand why a lot of people are kind of flipping out over this, because they're thinking, wait, how are you just throwing away just war theory like this? So there's some concerns about that. Now, let me say this. I think on the one hand, the question of AI, its applicability, some of the concerns that we, I'm sure, all share about its use is certainly relevant to today and rightly deserves an encyclical. I'm not sure, however, if it deserves to be the first encyclical. Like, it's an important issue. It's a fire that needs to be put out. But I do think that there are some bigger fires right now that need to be put out, both within the church and outside the church. So if the Pope's focus is on, well, let's talk about what's going on in the world rather than addressing the problems of the church first. Okay, I think there are some other things that need to be addressed first before AI. Or if the conversation is, let's clean up our own house first before we try to tell everybody else to clean up and try to tell people outside the church how to do things. Well, there's some other things that need to be addressed in the church first before AI. So I was kind of left scratching my head thinking, okay, I understand the need to address AI. It's a legitimate concern. I think it should have an encyclical, but I just think that other things need to be addressed first. both within the church and outside the church. Um, Within the church, look, we've talked for years now about a lot of the problems we're seeing in the church. Um, a situation where there's just no discipline whatsoever. There's no consequences for outright heresy and a rejection of the faith on part of bishops. Pride masses gone wild. I mean, I think that needs to be addressed first. I think there needs to be an encyclical for that. And if we're having a conversation of things outside the church, if we're talking about let's fix everyone else's problems instead of addressing the church's problem first, okay. I literally just watched a video yesterday of Israeli soldiers and Israeli politicians using the Bible to justify killing babies in Gaza. So, for example, one of them was quoting Psalm 137:9. And Psalm 137:9, the psalmist says, blessed are those who, take your children and dash them against the rock. He's talking about smashing their heads against the rock. And blessed are those who kill your babies. And they were quoting that as justification for their killing of babies in Gaza. We have seen Israel quote the passages about Amalek, the destruction of the Canaanites, kill men, women, and children, commanded by God in the Old Testament. For example, 1 Samuel, leave none of them alive, spare none. We've seen them use those biblical passages to justify the cleansing of the land today for what they're doing in Gaza and now Lebanon. We're seeing them use the Bible for genocide and ethnic cleansing. Now, is there a conversation that we can have about the proper interpretation of those passages? Of course. That's the conversation that I think Pope Leo needs to be having right now. I think that it would be very effective if the Pope said, look, there are a lot of, as they're called, dark passages in the Bible that are currently being used right now for a new Holocaust. And, as the successor of Peter and as one who is to guard the deposit of faith, here's the correct interpretation of those passages. And here's how they don't lend themselves to what Israel is doing today. And, I'm condemning what Israel is doing today and how they're using the Bible or misusing the Bible. And offer a proper understanding of those passages with the full weight of the papacy, with a full authority of the papacy, to give people better direction in how to understand those passages. Because as it stands right now, there aren't any real authoritative magisterial interpretations of these passages in the Bible. And so you can find some Catholic laity who are saying, oh, it's all allegorical. It didn't really happen. It was just metaphorical. You can see others say, well, it's literal, but it's just not to be applied to today. There's different passages. And then there's others who just say, well, no, I don't accept plenary inspiration, and that part is just written by man and added by man and is not inspired by God. Okay, so you can see a range of positions among your average Catholic layman. And so everybody's just kind of left to different perspectives and different interpretations. Here's where I think the Pope needs to come out and say, let me offer a clear and authoritative interpretation of these passages that don't lend themselves to what Israel is doing. And unequivocally condemn what Israel is doing and also Zionism. There needs to be a whole encyclical on the error of Zionism. It is the error of the world today, right now. We're watching a new Holocaust. How is this not the number one topic that a pope addresses? I don't know. He has spoken a little bit about it critically, but not in as direct as he should be. And I don't think he's offered any kind of full treatment on the matter. No pope has. No pope has really addressed the question of Zionism in any kind of authoritative way. Pius X had some offhand comments to Theodore Herzl, but that was it. Nothing authoritative, nothing magisterial. To me, I think the number one question he should be addressing is that problem. Zionism, its use of the Bible to justify its theft of the land and genocide of the people of Palestine. That is the problem of our day and age right now. That is what needs to be addressed first and foremost before we have a conversation of anything else. Sure, we can have a conversation of AI. I think that's great. Let's address that first, because that's the biggest, most pressing issue that we're seeing, at least in my eyes, and I think in the eyes of numerous others. You may disagree, but that's how I see it. And so that's why I'm just kind of left wondering, why isn't that addressed first? Okay. I think that needs to be addressed first. Then we can have conversations of AI. And I think those need to be done. Don't get me wrong. But first things first. And that's if we're taking this premise of let's try to fix the problems of the world before we fix the problems of the church. I kind of think, wait, hold on. Don't you need to get your own house in order before you have a conversation with everyone else about morality? I mean, we have cardinals and bishops gone wild right now, and Pope Leo is asleep at the wheel, and so have his predecessors been. Well, don't you need to address that first? You would think. Just my 2 cents. Those are my thoughts on the matter. Love to hear yours. Make sure to put them in the comment section. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you later.